Welcome, everybody. Thanks for joining us today for the next webinar in the MTW Expansion Asset Building Cohort Onboarding Series. Today's webinar is the MTW supplement to the PHA plan and the public process. Again, I am Laura Malakoff. I am with ICF, and I am excited to be facilitating this call today. So today we will cover the big question, what is the MTW supplement? And we will address what you will need to do to complete the MTW supplement. We'll talk about MTW waivers, including the definitions, the types of waivers, and how you should think about waivers in relation to the outcomes you want to see from your MTW program. We'll also talk about the specific requirements around waivers and activities that apply to you specifically as members of the asset building cohort. We will also talk about key things to know about conducting an impact analysis and a review of the hardship policy requirements. We'll talk about the public engagement process. We recognize that you have already been engaging with your community as part of your application to the asset building cohort, but as you know, it never stops. It's a process, and we will talk more about that today. So today we'll talk mostly about the what you have to do related to the MTW supplement. The next webinar, which takes place on March 15th, will build on what we talk about today, and we'll talk about exactly how to do it. So in that next webinar, we'll talk about the resources that will help you as you create your MTW supplement, and we'll discuss common MTW supplement errors, how to avoid them. But today we'll really be focusing on making sure you understand what the steps in the process are. Today we will be sure to leave some time at the end for Q&A. And we've built in time throughout our webinar to answer questions as they come up. So as Sean explained, please remember to ask your questions via the chat box. You can do that throughout the presentation. And when we break for questions, you can either type your question in the chat box or feel free to unmute yourself to ask questions during those Q&A periods. So I'm excited to introduce our speakers today from the MTW office. We're excited to have Crystal Mills, Allison Christensen, and Philip Pless on the line, and you'll be hearing from each of them today. And with that, I will turn it right over to Crystal. Crystal, go ahead.
All right, all unmuted. Hoping everyone can hear me clearly, but please put it in the chat if there's any issues at all. So as I said, as Laura said, I'm Crystal Mills. Thanks to everyone for joining us here today. I'm so excited to speak with you all about HUD Form 50075, also known as the MTW supplement to the PHA plan. So what is the MTW supplement? It's a web-based form that captures the reporting requirements for MTW expansion agencies by collecting information about what activities your expansion agencies may propose to undertake and the waivers that you request to be able to implement them. It will include information about how residents will be protected if any MTW activities create any hardships, and it will also provide information about the MTW agency's assessment of impacts of the activities themselves. The MTW expansion agencies will also use the MTW supplement to communicate your plans with residents and community stakeholders. We want to make sure that, we'll be talking a lot about that today and in our next webinar as well, and also about the public comment process. And that is really because we can't overstate the importance of community engagement enough to help you to really build a buy-in, identify issues that you may need to be addressed early on in the process. It's kind of also why we titled this MTW supplement to the PHA plan and the public process, because it's so important. And so We're going to be talking about specific additional requirements with the public engagement process to ensure that your community is really getting engaged and is ready for these many upcoming changes, and not just your community, but your staff as well. So through the supplement, you'll ultimately be submitted online through an interactive web-based form. There's a link within this presentation also to a PDF version of the form. You can easily create a mock-up of the MTW supplement using the form. You'll be able to use this document to communicate clearly and early with all of your stakeholders about what you're planning and why, what results you expect, and how residents will be protected if the activities were to potentially have any adverse effects. So the form is it's really a great source of information. And over time, we at HUD, we utilize the information collected to monitor and evaluate the MTW demonstration program with an overarching goal to identify activities that work well and that, if can be prudent, eventually be built into our future updates in the way that HUD's programs are ran and operated. So all MTW expansion agencies, including agencies who are designated as qualified agencies and exempt from the requirement to submit your annual PHA plans every 5 years, but all MTW expansion agencies must submit your MTW supplement every year. And you should aim to submit your MTW supplement no later than 75 days prior to your agency's fiscal year beginning. So it's really in the same line as you would when you submit your PHA plan to the field office every year. And just to expand on that point just a bit, you're going to submit annually, but as mentioned, for qualified agencies that are on the call. So per the MTW operations notice, you're not now required to submit your PHA plan annually, but you do have to submit your MTW supplement annually. You can continue to submit your PHA plan every 5 years, but you will now need to plan to submit your MTW supplement to HUD every year. Just had to repeat that because there's been some disconnect between qualified and non-qualified agencies. So now the MTW supplement is a supplement to the PHA plan. It does not take the place of the PHA plan submission, and it should be submitted at the same exact time as your PHA plan. The two are now happily married. They're, a kid, but they're in concert with one another, submitted at the same time. And so it can be a little confusing because the PHA plan will still be submitted in ways that you've always submitted it, likely via maybe emails directly to your field office. Whereas with the supplement being a web-based form submitted online, is going to be submitted in a different way. But you need to try to figure out in your planning of how you're going to submit these two at the same time on the same date, and you want to communicate with your field office on what your plans are to do so. Currently it's submitted online, and until further directed, just continue to submit your PHA plan in the same submission manner that you normally would. So next slide. Okay, so the sections of the MTW supplement, as I mentioned earlier, it's completed online, but with the online system, it will guide you through the 10 sections that you see listed here. And any online form can be just a little intimidating, but luckily this form is designed to really be helpful and guide you through the process. It uses smart logic to take you to the screens you need to complete, starting with section A with PHA information and then on to the narrative. It really will give you screeners and pop-up menus throughout and drop-down menus throughout to help you select the correct options, and helps you to ensure that you have really thought through the process and address all of the required safe harbors or any other things that are needed to properly and accurately to submit. And it also gives you places within this to upload your supporting documentation. So like hardship policies or impact analyses, we'll talk about those a little bit later. But when you get to certain sections within the supplement submission, so sections D, sections E, if it says, well, is the impact analysis included? It will ask you that directly onto the screen. And these are the sections, 10 sections here. So next slide, please. All right, mastering the MTW supplement. So you obviously have some steps to undertake before you actually complete an MTW supplement. So you don't really need to worry about right now mastering everything about the MTW supplement. But I do want to say and take a time early on to tell you that we're talking to you about this today. But for the moment, you need to really have a sense of what the MTW supplement requires and what steps that you need to take. So we've created this, plenty of resources, plenty of online trainings. We have a link here, right here, ready for you directly on this screen for additional support and information surrounding the MTW supplement. So when you're ready to get started, I urge you to please click on this link and look at the many resources that we have available to you. And those critical steps that you'll undertake before you complete the supplement, whether you're going to decide which specific waivers and which associated activities that will help your agencies, they're going to be, really walk through on some of the resources. So you don't need to master everything right now, but, we do want to make sure that you know that there's a video here for you to watch when you're ready to get started. Equally important to review is a job aid titled How to Use the System, which can also be found within the MTW supplement webpage. So when you get a chance, click the link, save, familiarize this, resources, and we're excited to keep going. So next slide. Okay, so now the types of different waivers. There are 4 types of waivers that I'm going to overview now. And just we'll really dive in after our training. You're going to want to read to really dive in after today. You're going to want to read section 4 of the MTW operations notice. You're going to want to familiarize yourself with Appendix 1 of the MTW operations notice. And another spectacular resource that we made available to you is the MTW online manual. So the entire section explaining the types of waivers and the requirements. And here again, for your convenience, you can see the link to the operations notice as well as the online manual are down there right at the bottom for you. And so to get started with the 4 types of waivers, HUD has pre-vetted 17 MTW waivers that permit a range of over 70 associated activities. And those pre-vetted MTW waivers and their associated activities can all be found in Appendix 1 of the MTW operations notice. So although the MTW waivers are pre-vetted, if you will, you still need a signed approval letter from your designated HUD field office that states that both your PHA plan and the MTW supplement have been approved before your agency is actually allowed to implement any of those activities. And I'll give you an example, a more involved example of the MTW waiver a little bit later. All right, and so we have our safe harbor waivers. And so many MTW waivers have safe harbor waivers, have safe harbors. Safe harbors are those additional requirements that specify the range of flexibility available when implementing one of those 70 associated activities. There's a lot of words may sound confusing. We're going to bring it all together. But what they do is the safe harbors, they outline the requirements when the MTW waiver is implemented. For example, depending on the activity itself, the safe harbors could include things like exempting elderly and disabled households or conducting an impact analysis or hardship policy to determine the effects, for the MTW waiver and protections for the MTW waiver's implementation. And so when an MTW waiver has safe harbors, your agency will need to follow all of them in order to implement the MTW activities without additional HUD approval. But sometimes one or more of those established safe harbors may not fit within, your agency's local needs or priorities. And if that safe harbor doesn't really align with those local priorities, then you may be able to request permission from HUD to expand outside of those listed waivers, those listed safe harbors. So this type of request, when you go outside of the safe harbors, is hence referred to as a safe harbor waiver. But please note that depending on the activity, some safe harbors cannot be waived. When you're reviewing the Appendix 1 of the MTW operations notice, looking at the safe harbor requirements and see a safe harbor that has an asterisk mark beside it, that asterisk indicates that a waiver is not allowed for that specific requirement. So a safe harbor waiver is not allowed for any safe harbor marked with an asterisk. I'm going to repeat it because it's important, and I'll show you an actual visual example of that in just a moment as well. All right, cohort-specific waivers. So as a part of the MTW expansion, HUD is studying specific policy changes. In this cohort, HUD will be evaluating asset building, as you may have heard. But cohort-specific waivers include statutory and regulatory waivers and associated activities outside of those that are included in Appendix 1. And they're unique to your specific cohort to allow them to complete the required cohort evaluation. So for you, with being part of the asset building cohort, you will have options. You will have cohort-specific waivers, but my amazing colleague Allison will go more into detail on those a little bit later. So that's all for that. I'll talk to you about the agency-specific waivers next. MTW agencies have used flexibilities offered under MTW to think broadly over many years. And what the thing that I like most about it is it's very solution oriented, and we try to encourage people to figure out ways to solve problems that are specific to the needs for their community. And there's so much that can be done inside of an MTW waiver and activity, though it is possible that to solve your local need outside of those MTW waivers is what is necessary. So if your agency is seeking to do something that is not a part of those pre-vetted MTW waivers, and you're looking to propose something new, something innovative that will help to meet your specific needs, then you could request an agency-specific waiver. It's important to note, though, regardless of what you can request it, but you have to remember that when assessing and ultimately proposing any possible solution that can help to meet your local need, the MTW agency-specific waiver can only be used to waive the 1937 Act and implementing regulations, which again is you have to first propose it to HUD, and it has to be approved in writing. And we recommend that you really start with the MTW waivers and any cohort-specific waivers first. There's a lot that can be done with the 17 MTW waivers and the 70 associated activities. So focusing in on this first year, help you to get started. Just focus on what you can do later on, if and when you choose to implement or to propose a safe harbor waiver, agency-specific waiver, then you'll want to be very, very thorough in your waiver description and include any appropriate citations. Doing so will greatly help to ensure less delays in the review process. I want to share that with you. And on to the next slide. Okay. So MTW waivers, the elements, what this will look like when you go to Appendix 1 of the operations notice. This is the format here that you'll see. It's also really well spelled out on the online training, gives you a lot of good resources and tips and hints within that. But the elements here, we'll start with waiver name and description, which details the authorization provided to your agency subject to the terms of the operations notice. Next are the statutes and regulations that may be waived to allow the MTW agency to implement any associated activities. Then you'll see a list of the permissible activities are organized by program type, i.e. the activity is being proposed for implementation under public housing and or housing choice voucher. So that's what that section means. And then finally, the safe harbors. Again, these are the additional requirements beyond those specified in the description up top, okay? And that the agency or agency must follow in order to implement the activity without additional HUD approval. Okay, so next slide. This one will just kind of give you a walkthrough. It's a real live example, if you will. This is what it will look like in Appendix 1 and the MTW operations notice. And in this case is a waiver of the minimum rent rules and allowing your PHA to establish minimum rent than what is currently allowed for non-MTW expansion agencies. So you see here, what it allows for is a minimum rent not to exceed $130 per month. So let's walk through this format together. See first, the waiver name is listed first. Then the description of the MTW activity and how it's permitted, how followed by the specific statutes and the regulations that are being waived. Notice again that in parentheses there, you see 1E is associated with public housing and 1F is associated with HCB, okay? Then in the last section, it lists out 4 specific parameters as required safe harbors. So not all MTW waivers have associated safe harbors, but if they do, you're going to need to pay attention to the section and you'll need to implement your activity within the associated safe harbors that are listed. You're not allowed to go outside of these without an actual safe harbor waiver request. So, HUD does suggest that you request a large number of safe harbor waivers, not request, like as you're getting started. I think that you'll be able to do a lot within this section, but I want to show you as you're thinking about it. For example, Roman numeral 1 specifies that rent policy must not exceed $130 per month. And number 2 states that they must exclude the elderly and disabled families. So let's say, for example, your PHA wants to implement this rent policy, but you want to exceed that and you want to exceed the minimum rent to $140 per month. Well, that request falls outside of the parameter, so therefore your PHA will need to request a safe harbor waiver. So for this activity, Roman numerals 1, it doesn't have an asterisk, so you can request a waiver, right? We've circled here Roman numerals 3 and 4, and that's because they do have asterisks beside them. So that's because if it's an asterisk, it's important to note that it is not eligible for a safe harbor waiver, okay? So you see here, it cannot be waived. The agency must conduct the impact analysis, and your agency must implement a hardship policy if you are to request to implement the minimum rent activity. So let's see. Just keep in mind that there's plenty of these. Always pay attention to the safe harbors. If you have questions, feel free to reach out as far as to the format. And we definitely, if you have questions throughout the training today, want to know about this, we can circle back to this if you have any questions. So next slide. Okay. All right, so some key takeaways, talked about what the MTW supplement is, the sections of the supplement, that it will be submitted as a web-based form, that your agency may implement activities associated with the MTW waiver contained within Appendix 1 of the MTW operations notice without further HUD approval, like once you get approval. But none of those things can happen until you ensure that these 4 things take place. Firstly, your agency's ACC has to be fully executed by HUD, right? Signed, countersigned, fully executed. Secondly, the activity must be included within the MTW supplement of a PHA plan. And the MTW supplement must be approved by the HUD field office. So what this will look like going forward is you will receive an approval letter from your HUD field office that indicates that both your PHA plan and your MTW supplement to the PHA plan has been reviewed and is considered approved for fiscal year, okay? Whatever is applicable. Third, the MTW agency must update the ACOP and our admin plan as applicable to be consistent with your MTW activities and related waivers. So once you are approved, you're going to immediately be expected to update that ACOP and your admin plan. And lastly, your agency must ensure that the activities will be implemented within the associated safe harbors unless you've received a safe harbor waiver or agency specific waiver. So for those safe harbor waivers, agencies are responsible for ensuring that you're implementing your activity throughout your program within the parameters. If for some reason in the future you should want to change it, you can request to change it in the future, at your next fiscal year beginning when it's time for submission, or you can, if something, comes up in mid-fiscal year, and you find that there's changes that need to take place, then you can also submit an amendment to your PHA plan so that with the purpose of amending your MTW supplement. All right. So obviously a lot that goes into the MTW supplement. We'll continue to talk to you more about a lot of this. And please, if you have any questions, I can't wait to hear more about those and answer your questions here today. I didn't dive too deep into the cohort specific waivers, and that's because Allison is going to talk about those next. So if we could advance into the next slide, and I will pass it on to you, Allison, to share more about the cohort specific requirements that they'll need to know.
Great. Thanks, Crystal. And hello, everybody. I'm Allison Christensen in the MTW office. Good to see everybody here today. As Crystal said, I'll be talking a little bit about the cohort specific waivers that are unique to the asset building cohort. So the first thing I wanted to mention before getting into the cohort specific waivers is that the asset building cohort, it specifically states in the selection notice that there are no restrictions on the type of waivers and associated activities for this cohort. So, for some of the other cohorts, we ask that they stay away from certain types of activities for the duration of the evaluation. But the good news is for you all that you don't have those types of restrictions to worry about. So anything that's available in the operations notice is available to you to use to create your local MTW program. So the next bullet we have here on some of your unique asset building cohort responsibilities is participation in the 2-year evaluation period. Now it's a little bit more than 2 years. So the 2 years refers to that the 24 months that you must provide your asset building activities to your participants. So the selection notice mentions that, it's going to take you some time to get ramped up and plan your activities. Then you must offer the asset building initiative to your population for at least 24 months. So that's the 2-year evaluation period where you'll be really active in the evaluation. And then after that, there will be some follow-on, possibly information collection and things like that. So I think the selection notice mentions 5 years from the point of enrollment. But really it's that 24 months, the 2 years when you'll be most active in the evaluation. So participation in that is a key of, your responsibilities under the asset building cohort. Now, each of your agencies may have a little bit of a different entry into the asset building cohort. So, and we understand that. So when you applied under one of 3 different options. You provide in your MTW supplement is going to vary a little bit depending on which one you're in. So the first option was an opt-out savings account. Under that option is a cohort specific waiver that's contained in the selection notice. And you'll notice if you flip to the selection notice, it looks a lot like the sample waiver that Crystal flashed on the screen there. So it's in the very similar format where it describes the waiver, talks about the statutes and regulations that are being waived, and then includes some safe harbors as well. So if you're in that opt-out savings account option, you're going to want to include the cohort specific waiver contained in the selection notice in your MTW supplement before you begin implementation of your opt-out savings account activity. The way to do that is very similar to how Crystal described the agency specific waiver. So you just put the information that would be in the similar format of an agency specific waiver and include that as an attachment to your MTW supplement. So you just kind of write the information narratively, pop it into a PDF and attach it to the MTW supplement, and the MTW supplement system allows you to do that. So there's not a specific cohort specific activity section of the MTW supplement, but you're going to want to do that under, like I said, the agency specific activity section. So that's kind of the process for your cohort specific waiver for the opt-out savings account option. There's also the credit building option that your agency may have applied to. The good news for this one is that the credit building option doesn't really contain any MTW specific flexibility. So for this one, there's not anything you need to specifically do in your supplement to meet the terms of the evaluation. So, that's the approval in the MTW supplement is not a part of that option. So you wouldn't be worried about anything under that option. And then finally, the PHA designed asset building option. This one really depends. So if you are using something that's akin to the opt-out savings account option where you're providing a direct amount of money to the households as kind of described in that first option, you'll want to use the cohort specific activity that gives you that flexibility. If you're doing more of a credit building activity, then you wouldn't need to do that. So So if you have any questions on whether or not you need the cohort specific waiver for that option, just reach out to your field office point of contact. And I think that's everything.
Well, thank you, Allison, and Crystal, and I think our next slide is a pause for questions. So we've got several questions in the chat, so we'll turn to those now. A couple of them have been answered in writing, but it may be helpful to just say those aloud so that we can make sure that everybody hears the answer. So we'll begin with those. The first question is whether you need to make a copy of the supplement for the local HUD office to submit with the agency plan. And the answer in writing that was provided in the chat is that you do not. You submit the supplement through the system, and the field office automatically gets an alert that it was submitted, and then they go into the system to review it. So thank you, Mitzi, for asking that question. Another question that was submitted in writing and answered in writing is, this is Jackie. She was wondering if it's correct that any changes to the MTW supplement after approval are considered a significant amendment as defined. And the answer is yes. The changes to the supplement would have to go through the public process and presented to the board for approval, and then submitted in the system as an amendment to the supplement. So Crystal, Allison, anything to add on that front before we turn to the other question? We have a question from Melissa, and the question is about if you increase the minimum rent, will this ultimately reduce your operating or HCV subsidy?
Sure, I can take that one, and Philip, maybe jump in if I get anything incorrect here. But for that, you're going to really want to look at the sections of the operations notice that talk about your public housing operating subsidy and your HCV calculations. I believe that tenant revenue is included in the operating subsidy calculation, so that may have an effect. And on the voucher side, I do not believe that it would be, since that's based on your expenses. So, Philip.
Sorry, can you ask the question again one more time?
So the question is, if you increase the minimum rent, will this ultimately reduce your operating or HCV subsidy?
So just as a reminder for everybody on calculations of funding sources, capital fund and operating costs are going to be based on the way that they're currently calculated for non-MTW PHAs. So for it's based on 990 for the operating fund. And then for capital fund, I'm not exactly sure how they calculate their funds, but you can find more information about that in the operations notice. So for on the HAP side of the house, remember that the HAP, the HAP, the Housing Assistance Payment Renewal Source, was designed in such a way that that takes into account the statutory language about MTW PHAs not either gaining or losing from their participation in the demonstration. So one of those steps to recall, as a part of that, we take a look at your MTW renewal eligibility cap and then what your actual expenses is. So your renewal eligibility cap is just remember, it's the sum of your inflated per unit cost times the number of months times the number of authorized ACC units. So that's what we'll do first. That's what the Financial Management Division and the HCV FMD will do that first. The second step they're going to do is they're going to take a look at your total eligible expenses, and they're going to compare which of those is the lower, and that's going to be how it's done. So in terms of like increasing rents, it could potentially it could potentially increase your HAP funding, but you have to keep in mind that we have that built-in sort of, I hate to piggyback off or steal Allison's thunder here, but we do have a safe harbor, so to speak, designed in the HAP renewal formula to ensure that MTW agencies are not either gaining or losing as a result of their place in the demonstrations. That's a bit of a long-winded answer. So it's kind of a sort of a nuanced thing because it really does just depend on, you have to go through that process and take a look at what your examples are going to be. If we want to talk more about that, different things and how that impacts things offline, we can. But I would really encourage everyone just again to take a look at the MTW Insider that went out, where we actually went through a calculation and an example of how that's done, just as a reminder, because that kind of, I think, is the best visual way for you to sort of see how this process is going to play out after you execute your ACC amendment for 2020, for some agencies in 2024, but I guess it just depends on the timing. But anyway, sorry, that's a little bit of a long-winded answer, but I just want to remind folks of those points, because those are really important points as it pertains to calculations of funds.
Thank you, Philip. Okay. So in the interest of time, let's turn to some questions that were posed that have not been answered in writing. So one question from Melissa. Is it permissible to propose changes to the ACOP and admin plans simultaneously with the MTW supplement and selection of waivers to streamline the public meeting process?
I'm looking for the question in the chat. Can you repeat it also?
Sure.
I got it. Okay.
So Melissa asks whether it is permissible to propose changes to the ACOP and admin plans at the same time with the supplement and the selection of waivers so that they can streamline the public meeting process.
I see. Well, the thing is that you're going to want to give like real factual updates to your ACOP and admin as to what has been approved and what your agency is now doing. So I kudos though for trying to streamline the process as best as possible, for sure. But you're going to want to, you can communicate, in advance to the public about what you're going to do by using the MTW supplement PDF. But what you're actually approved to do, once you receive HUD approval in writing, that is what you're going to need to do to update and reflect all of the approved MTW waivers or your safe harbor waivers, everything that your agency has been approved to implement directly into the ACOP and admin plan. So it wouldn't be simultaneously, it would be approval and then update. A great question.
Thank you, Crystal. We are going to go ahead and move on, but there will be plenty of more opportunity to ask questions as we go. I will draw your attention to a comment from Rain, who has provided some insight into what they have done. So I invite you to take a look at that in terms of timing of the reviewing the draft MTW supplement and what happens beyond that. So I invite you to take a look at that. And if you have any further questions, we will have more opportunities as we go. But with that, I'm going to turn it back to Allison to continue on with impact analysis.
Oh, great. Thanks, Laura. And before I get cooking here, can I just make sure, can you hear me? Am I good? Okay. All right. All right. Just wanted to check before I get rolling here. So we're next slide, please. Going to start talking about the impact analysis and some key things to know. So to start off, what is an impact analysis and why would your PHA want to do one? It's a way, we think that it's a chance for your agency to think systematically about the benefits that you expect to see from an activity and the potential consequences or hardships that that activity might bring. MTW is a demonstration program. As agencies get ready to start on new activities, it's imperative to think through things in a systematic way. And you'll never be penalized for, if an activity doesn't go as you expected it to, but this is your chance on the front end to try and avoid some pitfalls and potential negative consequences. So on the screen here, we have some key things to know about the impact analysis. So it's not required annually for every activity, but it is required annually for some activities. And I'll discuss that more. We have a little chart on a future slide that we can go over. That's not to say that you couldn't even if you're not required to provide the impact analysis to HUD every year, your agency might decide that it's a good business practice to just conduct one, or maybe conduct one on a few of the factors that are really going to be a big part of your activity every year to do an ongoing check of how the activity is going. When an impact analysis is required, your PHA is the entity that decides how to approach it. HUD does not specify how you conduct an impact analysis. We give you a number of required factors that must be considered, but the way that you approach those is up to the PHA and how it's going to be most useful for you. A single impact analysis can be done in a way that encompasses multiple activities or related to a comprehensive initiative. So what do we mean by this? You could say have a comprehensive rent initiative that includes a number of activities, and it wouldn't make sense to do an impact analysis for like each discrete part of the rent policy. In that case, your agency may decide that they want to do an impact analysis that encompasses a broader number of activities, and that's absolutely fine and up to the PHA. If your agency wanted to do one specifically for each activity, that's again up to the PHA. So you would be in the driver's seat of determining how that would go. And then when is an impact analysis required? As Crystal noted and had on the screen there earlier, when there's an asterisk, or when there is when it's listed in the safe harbor section, that's when it's required by HUD. And if there's an asterisk next to the entry, then it's not waivable as a safe harbor waiver. So you want to pay attention to those safe harbors of when an impact analysis is required. And I think pretty much throughout the operations notice, I think it's never able to be waived. So it'll be required if it's a part of those safe harbors. Now, as you decide how to go about doing an impact analysis, keep in mind the questions that we've been discussing and how you could best approach this. So you can bring in a range of people to the table early and to help support in the planning and implementation of your new activities. And we recommend that you incorporate the impact analysis through all of those conversations. Think about the insights that you can get from your PHA staff, your residents, and the public about the impacts that you may not have thought about alone. Getting together a broader range of people can only improve, thinking about more elements of the activity. After that, consider the value of knowing what impacts others may anticipate. If they are right about the issues that you did not foresee, then you can brainstorm to come up with some potential mitigation factors to head off potential problems and to account for additional upsides that you may not have realized as well. If people have misconceptions, it's always better as part of kind of the change management to bring people in early, and you may need to explain things in a different way that you anticipated. Perhaps the messaging on an issue, you can flag that, it's not coming across as you intended it to. And in that case, an impact analysis and bringing more people to the table can help you adjust that messaging so that you're communicating clearly with your stakeholders. And again, this helps to head off any surprises that can often lead to backlash. So if you're involving staff and residents in the community in the impact analysis, that can help avoid such surprises. So impact analysis information can be found in Appendix 2 of the operations notice all the way in the back, and that is linked right at the bottom of this slide. So it's after all of the activities at the very end. Next slide. So here we have all of the kind of a summary of all of the different factors that must be included in an impact analysis. So the MTW operations notice outlines 9 factors that must be assessed and considered when developing the impact analysis. And keep in mind that this is done before implementation. It's the first time that this occurs. You see disparate impact there above the top. So it's listed as one of the elements in the operations notice that must be considered throughout all of the factors. So you see it here as kind of an umbrella over the other 8 factors. So that disparate impact should be kind of woven into all of the other factors. So sometimes you could have a situation where you don't need, your activity won't be affected by a particular factor. So for example, changing the frequency of your HQS inspections, that wouldn't necessarily have an effect on the affordability for affected families. But you still need to consider each one individually and assess whether there could be an impact. So if you conclude in that case, that affordability wouldn't be impacted, you just need to document that. So don't just avoid it altogether. You would say, we considered affordability and it's not affected by this activity. So here are some things to think about for each of the various factors. And again, these are just suggestions. Your agency is able to kind of approach these factors as works best for you. So the first is on the agency's finances. First, a way to do this, you could consider staff time and changes in the amount of subsidy provided that affect the agency's finances and how that could affect your bottom line. For the housing cost affordability, you could consider whether changes you are implementing have an effect on the residents' ability to afford their rent. So whether or not those rent prices are going up or down might improve affordability or it might have a negative impact. It could go either way. For the wait list, you could consider how certain changes will affect how long residents will remain on the waiting list. So again, it could be maybe the case that folks are waiting longer on the wait list, or it could be an activity that turns your wait list faster. It could go either way. The termination rate, you could consider whether terminations are likely to increase or decrease as a result of your activities and what the magnitude of those changes might be. Number 5, here we have public housing occupancy level and voucher utilization. Could consider how the changes you are implementing will affect occupancy and voucher utilization, whether one or the other might go up or down depending on the activity. Number 6 is your ability to meet the MTW statutory goals, and we call these statutory objectives too. So these are the key components of the MTW demonstration on cost effectiveness, self-sufficiency, and housing choice. Often those statutory objectives are kind of in tension with one another, so it's okay if maybe the activity is highlighting one more than the other. That's absolutely fine, but you want to just kind of make a note of that there. And then separate from the statutory objectives, number 7 is on the agency's ability to meet the 5 statutory requirements of the MTW program. So these are the very low income requirement, the requirement that the agency establish a reasonable rent policy, the substantially the same number of families requirement, comparable mix of families requirement, and the requirement to continue to meet housing quality standards established by the secretary. So you want to ensure that the activity is going to allow you to continue to meet those 5 requirements. And then the final one here, number 8, is the rate of hardship requests and the number granted and denied as a result of an MTW activity. So, you're not going to be able to know for sure at the this is done before the activity begins. So you're not going to be able to know for sure, but just kind of use, what you predict is going to happen as a result of the activity and try and think of ways to, if you expect a lot of hardships, how to mitigate that or how to communicate the hardship policy in a more effective way or things like that if you know that that's going to be an issue. So those are all the factors that you must consider. Next slide. So here's the chart that I was talking about earlier. When is an impact analysis required? So let's kind of break it down. And again, it's just a guide. When you're wondering if an impact analysis is required, the best place to go is always to look in the operations notice at the specific activity that you're looking at and look there because that's going to be the most accurate information. But to kind of give you a guide and idea of when things are required, we have the different situations here on the left and then the timing of the impact analysis along the top. So you have prior to implementation, annually during implementation, and at closeout. So let's review this table here. On the top line of the chart, you can see for the pre-approved MTW waivers that do not list an impact analysis as a safe harbor, you are never required to do an impact analysis. So you don't need to submit that information to HUD. Then similar or kind of the opposite on the bottom line of the chart, some activities HUD specifically requires an impact analysis prior to implementation, annually during implementation, and again at the end of the activity. So that will be specifically notated in the MTW operations notice. It'll say, you have to hit an impact analysis at all 3 of those points. And then the middle situations here for all the other waivers, the MTW waivers with impact analysis required as a safe harbor waivers, and agency-specific waivers. You have the need to perform an impact analysis before implementation begins and again after the implementation ends. So it's a bookend. If you're performing one at the beginning, we always want you to perform one at the end if you decide to discontinue an activity, so that we have that information contained. And then you see those yellow circles in the middle, the annually, that's kind of an it depends. So it's going to depend on the type of activity, specifically, especially for the safe harbor waivers and agency specific waivers. If it's something that's particularly impactful, it could be a requirement that you do one annually, but you would hear from in your approval that would need to be done. And again, that's just the requirement. If you have, if you've gone through the steps of doing an impact analysis, we really recommend that it's a great idea to continue to look at it regular intervals to make sure everything's going as you expected. So again, as I said, this is a useful graphic, but always be sure to reference the operations notice for details. And then if it's needed annually, that'll be stated in the ops notice and in your approval letter. Figuring out how to do an impact analysis, especially prior to implementation, can be hard. We would like to point you to the online manual for the interactive training, similar to how Crystal mentioned earlier with the MTW supplement. There's sections there on the impact analysis that can help you as well and walk you through how to do it and share some examples. And again, just to kind of close, when an impact analysis is required, it's a formal way that HUD requires you to communicate to the agency and to the public about your anticipated effects of your activities. But even if it's not required, again, just want to continue to encourage you. It's a good practice, even if you're not hitting every one of the 8 factors. Maybe you decide that 2 or 3 of them are going to be really useful for you to look at. We really recommend that you continue to take a look at it so you can see if things are happening as you expected. Okay, next slide. All right, so here's just some closing thoughts on how to plan for an impact analysis. You'll want to think about who will be assigned to conduct the initial impact analysis. Here you want to think about, are you going to have one lead staff member that's going to bring in a team of people, different departments leading different type elements of the impact analysis? You want to be just sure to think through all of those elements. What methods or tools are you going to use to collect data? So does your existing data system contain data that you need, or will you perhaps be collecting additional information? And will you need to put that additional information in some sort of Excel-based tool or other tracker so you can consolidate the additional data that you collect? Who's going to do that data collection, and how will the data be stored? You want to make sure you think about that ahead of time. Next, how will you analyze results? If you're clear about the data included in the impact analysis, what formulas are you going to use to analyze the data? Do you have the staff in place to do that analysis? And will you need to do that in-house, or perhaps engage another outside entity to do the analysis? A lot of great partners out there in academia and other resources for you. Next, how often will you need to reassess or repeat? And again, that's, there's kind of 2 answers there. There's the reassessment that you would be required to do, and there's maybe you decide that you want to do it a little more often. So we encourage you to think about that ahead of time as you're formulating your impact analysis, and think about what your end goals are and what are the possible consequences of the activity that you want to keep an eye on. Next, what methods will you use to deliver the assessment results? So how are you going to share the results with the public? You want them to be simple and clear and be able to explain the results in a way that people can understand. How you deliver those results to staff to perhaps make adjustments to the activity. You want to think about how that delivery is going to occur. How will you respond to the results? So if the impact analysis identifies an element of the activity that is not working quite as you expect, will you make adjustments? Will you bring in staff or other outside entities to help you make those adjustments, or is there going to be a level at which you make an assessment like that? And then finally, what will you do if you're seeing weak or even negative results? So kind of thinking ahead of time on when you would possibly pull the plug for an activity. It's good to kind of think of that ahead of time, and what are the risks that the agency is willing to tolerate as a part of your activities. So good to think about that in the initial phases of the impact analysis. Next slide. Okay, so we have some, you guys are the, I think, what, fourth cohort now. So we have some kind of lessons learned from other PHAs that have gone through this process as the MTW expansion. So one major one is take your time, and you'll hear this from us a lot, take your time and don't do too much at once. That's, I think, the kind of broadest overall lesson we've learned from expansion PHAs so far. We know everybody's really excited to, get into these activities, but as you can see, there's a lot of background work that goes into developing and implementing the activities. So you have 20 years in the demonstration, and just kind of take your time to really think through the activities as much as possible. And I think the impact analysis is a big part of that. Next, I've said this a lot too, but engage stakeholders early and often. Although this takes some time at the outset, we think that it will really save you some time and aggravation down the road if you make a clear effort to communicate clearly with your stakeholders that that's only going to benefit the agency. And then think about your impact. And that's kind of the key part of the impact analysis. So, we have it in there. It's required for certain activities, but it's also a tool for you to use to think through what you're doing as an agency and to connect those to the goals that you're trying to accomplish. So think about your impact. And then finally, at the bottom of the slide here, we have some resources available for you. So specific requirements on conducting impact analyses and hardship policies are provided in Appendix 2 of the operations notice. So that's the kind of original source information there for you. And then, as I mentioned, the online manual has very helpful interactive trainings to walk you through each step of the impact analysis. Talks about disparate impact and how to look at that. And it also walks through each of the other 8 factors to give you some examples of how to approach those as well. And then also the last link here is the impact analysis and hardship policies webinar from October of 2021, and the corresponding slides where we get into even more detail on these topics. So I think with that, I will turn it over to Laura.
Thank you again, Allison. And I think with that, let's turn to a little goal or knowledge check so that we can kind of learn a little bit more about what Allison just presented. So Sean, if you could pull up poll number 2 for us. And the question here is true or false? Experienced MTW agencies recommend assessing the impact of your MTW activities even when it is not required. So you should see the poll feature on the right hand of your screen. If you do not see it, check the poll button at the bottom right of your screen, and it should pop up. And select your answer, either true or false, and be sure to hit the submit button when you're done. So again, true or false? Experienced MTW agencies recommend assessing the impact of your MTW activities even when it is not required. Hopefully folks can see that poll, and we'll give folks another moment or two to answer the question. Hopefully you guys have had a chance to respond to that. Let's go ahead and close the poll and see what you all think. Hopefully the results of that poll will appear shortly. All right, so the majority of you have responded that the answer is true, and you are correct. Assessing the impact is the only way to know if the activities are really having the result that you desired. This tells you what is worth continuing, what you might need to adjust, and what you might need to discontinue because it has some kind of negative effect. So thanks for responding. And that actually brings us to a question that came in from Dawn about results that may have a negative impact. So if you request a waiver and it's approved, how long should you keep it implemented, even if you notice a negative impact? And then if you do cancel it, what is the procedure for doing so?
Sure, that is a great question. And as I said, it's really up to the agency to decide what that risk tolerance is and the negative impacts. You'll definitely get feedback from HUD, if we're starting to see specific negative effects, but you want to have a plan in place where you're keeping an eye on things. And if an impact gets to be negative enough that the agency wants to pull the plug, you want to have a plan in place for how to do that. And the procedure for kind of canceling or discontinuing an activity, there could be, if there's a requirement for an impact analysis at the beginning, again, that's a bookend process. So there's going to be an impact analysis that you'll need at the end. And just take a look at the MTW supplement. There's different categories of activities. And one of those is if you were discontinuing an activity. So you'd want to kind of, move it from a implementing status to a discontinued status, and then provide the information that the supplement asks for.
And next question from Rain. She wants to know, is there a deadline for submitting the MTW supplement in the online system?
Oh, I can take this one. So there's no deadline, I would say, but well, yes and no, right? So first of all, you're not going to actually submit your MTW supplement without being, having your ACC fully executed. But once you are ready to go, you need to try to go ahead and strive to either submitting your MTW supplement by amending your PHA plan, because remember that they in concert with one another, they travel together. So you're going to want to submit your MTW supplement submission 75 days prior to the start of your fiscal year beginning. And if not, if you're seeking to go ahead and start implementation immediately, then what you would do is you would go ahead and address it as an amendment to your PHA plan and submit it in that manner. Okay.
All right. And two questions about public hearings and public engagement, which we will turn to soon. But before we get there, I'll just put things out there for you guys to respond to. After the public hearings, it sounds like you will, this is from Rain, you will have the Resident Advisory Board review public comments received, and then based on their input, make final edits to the supplement, and then it is ready. And similarly, Melissa says they met with the Resident Advisory Board, reviewed changes along with the waivers they were considering, and then did the same thing for the public hearing. So in those two cases, is that sufficient, or is there anything else that they must do first?
So I think I probably need to take a closer look to see everything that was done and submitted before I just say yes, absolutely. But I will say we will go into more detail in part 2 as to the step-by-step processes, what and timelines of what and when should happen. But that does sound good. It sounds great that they've met with the Resident Advisory Board. In addition to the Resident Advisory Board, you're going to want to meet to your community stakeholders, to any organizations, not just the residents themselves. And then the public hearing would take place after 45 days after actually publishing all of your plans and initiatives. You have to publish those out for a review for 45 days, and then follow up with the public hearing. So I'm not sure if that agency has done that, but that is the process. And I'm so happy to hear that people are going in the right direction and engaging early on. So
More on public engagement in a few moments. But right now, let's go ahead and move on to talking about hardship policies, but know that we do have some additional time dedicated at the end and a few other breaks in between to address some more questions. With that, I'll turn it back to Allison.
Okay, thanks, Laura. So here we're going to talk about hardship policies and some key things to know on hardship policies. So the first point here is that each agency must adopt a written hardship policy. And in fact, the safe harbor sections of many of those MTW waivers requires a hardship policy. So again, going back to that example that Crystal flashed on the screen, you saw that a hardship policy was a required element of a minimum rent activity. So how do you conduct a hardship, or how do you create a hardship policy? There's guidance for you in the operations notice. Again, Appendix 2 of the MTW operations notice provides specific requirements related to hardship policies. And here, let me note that those specific elements we have seen kind of at the beginning of the expansion as agencies were getting started. We saw a lot of agencies kind of just copy and paste the hardship policy from the operations notice into their MTW supplement and submit that. We just want to say that that's, those are the requirements that are in the MTW operations notice, but we really want the agencies to take the required elements and adapt that to the specific activity. So you want to tailor the requirements to something that makes sense with regard to the specific activity that you're creating a hardship policy for. So a clear hardship policy will give your agency the ability to be consistent in determining when a requirement or provision of an MTW activity creates a financial or other hardship for the policy. So that's kind of the reason we ask it to be in writing, and so it can be uniformly applied. And another kind of key point is that you can have a single hardship policy for multiple MTW activities, or you could develop different hardship policies for different MTW activities. So this is another case, again, where you have the specific requirement, but it's really up to the agency how to implement that requirement and how to tailor it to work best for your agency. So in either case, you want to make sure that the policy is clear and easy to understand, and that families know when and how to access it. And that it's reviewed with residents during intake and recertification. You want to be able to make sure that people have the information they need on the hardship policy, because when they're looking to access the hardship policy, it's probably going to be in a time that might be stressful for the family or the household. So you want to make sure that they know about that information and what to do before they encounter those hardships. So again, at intake and recertification, you want to continue to make sure they know those resources are available. Next slide. So another key part here is if a hardship policy is required, it must outline how the agency will immediately provide an exemption from the activity at a reasonable level and duration. Again, so that's the example of the information or the requirement that's in the operations notice, but you'll want to take that information and adopt it to what makes sense for your agency. Also, another point is that there must be a second level grievance procedure that households are able to access if they're requesting a hardship. So you want to have that first level that it's reviewed, and then a second level of review as a part of a grievance. And the hardship policy, just like the impact analysis, it's not directly in the MTW supplement system form. So you'll want to just write it as required, with the required elements on in a PDF and attach that to the MTW supplement system. And we ask that you just be really clear in labeling those documents, so that if you have multiple hardship policies for different activities, just make sure that the reviewer and that the community is able to see which hardship policy is associated with which specific activity, or if it's a hardship policy that encompasses many activities, make sure that it's known that that's a more broad policy that is affecting different elements. So just be very clear on the what the hardship policy addresses. And then lastly, we have some resources at the bottom of the page. Again, Appendix 2 of the operations notice, that's the source material, this link down there. And then a training on some sample hardship policies is on the HUD Exchange that's available for you too. So we encourage you to access those resources. Next slide. And here we have just a sample process. I know we're kind of getting tight on time, so I won't go into too great a detail on this, but this is just kind of a systematic way to think about how to develop your hardship policy. and how to implement it as you need it with families. So, the first step is to develop the hardship policy, identify the situations that might constitute a financial or other hardship for your community, come up with a plan on how to notify folks, make sure you're reviewing that information on an ongoing basis, implement, make sure you're consistently implementing that information, and then finally record. You want to make sure many of the MTW activities that require a hardship policy also require that you report out on how many hardships were received during the year and how many were granted or denied. So you want to make sure that you're, taking steps to record that information as these hardships are being requested. And with that, I will turn it back over to Laura.
Okay, let's move on to our next slide, which is opening it up again for questions. So it looks like we've got a question in from Nikki related to the impact analysis. If an activity states in the safe harbor that it requires an impact analysis, but it doesn't state that it's required annually, does this mean that it is just required upon implementation and closeout? So she gives an example, 2B for payment standards in the safe harbor says that it requires an impact analysis. 7B says that it requires an annual impact analysis.
Yes, so for the impact analysis, I don't have those. I didn't look up those specifically yet, but if it's an annual requirement, it will say so in the operations notice. The kind of exception to that is if it's a safe harbor waiver or an agency specific waiver, those wouldn't specifically be in the operations notice because it's specific to your agency. So if you need an annual impact analysis for that would be in your approval letter that you receive from the field office. It would say, this agency specific waiver is approved and will require an annual impact analysis. If that's not the case, that it requires an annual, but it does require an impact analysis, again, you're looking at doing one at the beginning of the activity and at the end. So it's always a bookend. If it requires one at the start, then if you close out, it's going to require one at the end.
And then just to confirm, Nikki would like to confirm that, did you state that the hardship policy must be implemented? Can you elaborate on that?
I'm not, maybe could we get some clarifying? So the hardship policy, so it must be in writing for the activities that it's required. And I guess, I don't know it by implemented, but it must be in writing, and then you must use it for the activities as the activities are implemented. So if you have an activity that's implemented that requires a hardship policy, then that hardship policy would be implemented, I guess, at the same time, if that answers the question.
Looks like Missy said, got it. So I think you've answered her question.
Great.
One more question from earlier from Rain about the supplement deadline. Going back to what we had said earlier about the deadline, the question is, so the deadline of July 1st, 2023 implementation, then it would be 75 days prior. Can you all confirm?
So as a caveat also, I'm happy this actually came back. So you're also going to want to make sure that you're speaking with, the evaluators to make sure that if they have a requirement that you're following that. But Rain, if you have a July 1 start date, then it would be the same process as when you would typically submit in your PHA plan. So because remember, they're going together. So that should be the goal. You can request to your field office for an extension as well. But the goal should be, going forward 75 days prior, that the same time in which you would submit your PHA plan, which is typically 75 days prior, that it would go at the same time. Right, and then so you would then update the admin in ACOP later after of approval. I'm waiting for your text, for the text to come in the chat. I'm hoping that's helpful. And you can always also reach out to the MTW info mailbox if you have any questions as well pertaining that.
Thank you, Crystal. With that, let's go ahead and send it over to Philip, and he will talk about the things you need to think through to get started with your MTW supplement.
Okay, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you all for being so patient. We know this is a long webinar. This is one of the most important topics that we're covering in onboarding, and that's what you guys need to implement your MTW supplement. And as you guys recall, you know, the reason why this is so important is after you become an MTW agency, in order to implement new activities, you have to go through the supplement approval process, right? So I'm sure you guys are very excited about your MTW designation, and you guys have probably have a lot of thoughts about kind of what we've covered in today's webinar so far. We've covered a lot of things. The structure of the supplement form, safe harbors, impact analysis, and all of these good things. So there's a lot. This slide sort of just is stating like these are the sort of thoughts that you guys might be thinking about as you start to sit down and put pen to paper with your supplement. And the supplement really asks, you know, for a lot of, basically is asking for a kind of a guidebook or a roadmap of what you're going to do with your MTW designation, right? So questions around like, what do you want your impact to be? What are your goals? You know, what are you hoping to achieve as a result of your participation in the MTW program? Obviously, one of the major evaluation goals and things that you guys are going to be looking at is there different asset building strategies for your residents, but there could be other plans and goals and things that you want to achieve as well. Who is your target population? Keeping these things in mind is really important. And as you start to look at these sort of broader topics, they're going to drill down into more specific topics. And that's really where you're going to start to think about things like, okay, well, what waivers do I need to use? Does this waiver require a safe harbor and a hardship policy? Do I need to do an impact analysis associated with this waiver? So all these different things, kind of think of it like a hierarchy, you know, or a pyramid, and you start at the top, it's very broad. You go down, you drill down into more specific things, right? So let's pause for a second to take a look at where you guys are in the process of planning and getting ready to submit your MTW supplement. So ICF, I believe we have a poll question number 4. If you could go ahead and launch that, that would be great. And I'm going to read this question for our 508 reasons. So the poll question is, how far along are you in your thinking about what you need to get started? So the first option is A, I have identified all of our first year waivers. B is I have identified my plans for the year, my desired impact, and my goals, but I'm not sure what waivers I need yet. And then the last option is I still need more thinking on plan, impact, and goals first. So I'm going to read the responses again. A is identified all of our first year waivers. B is I've identified my plans for the year and my desired impact and goals, but I don't know which waivers I need to use. And then C is I still need more time to think about plans, impact, and goals first. So we're going to leave this poll open for a few more seconds so that you guys have a chance to respond. And then we're going to talk about the results a little bit together. So I would say maybe like 5 more seconds, we can close the poll and take a look at what you guys did. Okay, so it looks like the poll has closed. And let's see. We'll get those results here shortly. Okay, so it looks like we've got a pretty even split here of the folks who have responded to the poll questions. So it looks like about 9 of you have identified all of the waivers that you need. Several of you have identified plans and what you want your impact to be, but you're not sure what waivers you'll need. And then C, a lot of you have also responded that you still need more time to think about what you want to do in terms of ironing out your supplement. So let's just talk about this for a second. And so for option A, you know, for those of you who answered in this manner, it's great that you have made it so far and you're thinking, but just make sure that you have fully thought out a lot of these great things that Allison, you know, and other presenters today have mentioned regarding those early questions. So thinking about ironing out details about what households are going to be affected as a result of your policies, what they have to do to relate to your, you know, things that are related to your impact analysis and hardship policy and things of that nature. For those of you who have sort of, you're somewhere in the middle of this process, you know, just keep in mind that, you know, the appendix in the back of the operations notes has all of the waivers that you would need to, but we're going to cover some additional information here in just a little bit to kind of make sure to get you on the right track and just continue along this path because you guys have made great progress. And for those of you who are really not sure sort of, you know, either where to start or, you know, what you want to accomplish as a result of your supplement, don't worry, don't fret. There's so many resources I know that we've talked about today, and there's a lot of other great resources both on the HUD Exchange and also on the MTW website that will really help you get started in jogging your thoughts along. And of course, we're always here to provide assistance as well. So next slide, please. All right, so to begin with, and these are really sort of big high-level goals or things that you want to think about before you get started, is make sure that you are collaborating with your community and stakeholders to set your goals. You know, this is a really important way to think about this. Is it's a plan for all of your thinking about what you want to do with your MTW designation. So an important part of a planning process is making sure you're collaborating with your stakeholders and your community and your residents to set those goals. Next, what you'll do after you start that collaboration process is you're going to identify what activities that you want, that you think will have the desired impact that you want to need. And then as a part of that activity identification process, you're going to really need to take a really close look at what waivers you're going to need in order to implement your activities, right? So you kind of think about this as a three-step process, and you guys are sort of essentially at different steps of the process right now, but these are really important things to keep in mind. And like, let's go to slide 27, please. Let's advance to slide 27 here to wrap up this section. So, you know, you have a lot of questions and things to think through, and these are sort of the key questions that you guys want to keep in mind as you get started. But just really keep in mind that, you know, this process can look overwhelming and it might look difficult and complicated, but it doesn't need to be. Just take a look at these questions as sort of a framework for you to think through. And as you get through the planning process and you see and any of these questions are, you know, tricky or things of that nature, we're always here to help. And there's also a lot of resources. But these are sort of key questions that you want to take in mind and think about as you start the planning process and getting through your supplement process and getting that submitted to your local field office for processing. So let's take a break here. Let's take a pause, and I'm going to turn it back to Janet. Before we go to a break, actually, let's see if there's any additional questions that have come in. Or sorry, Laura, were there any additional questions that came in during this section, or can we go on a break?
Yeah, so it looks like we do have one more question that has come in recently, not necessarily specifically about what you just covered, Philip, but let's turn to it now. The question is from Lindsay. Her question is, for those who are on the June 30th fiscal year end, their documents have to be completed and ready for public comment, so they also included them for review, the ACOP and the admin plan. But now it sounds like they may need to pull back those changes until after approval. Is that correct? And I'll send that over to Crystal.
Right. So there's been like a lot of comments regarding this and a lot of back and forth. So what we'll do is we will circle back internally here. And I know for a fact that the MTW supplement being a part of the PHA plan means that after the MTW supplement is then approved, that means hence it's going to be the PHA plan and the MTW supplement that's been approved. And so then the MTW operations notice says that the ACOP and the admin should be updated. Ideally, if it's the same as what was originally submitted, then I would think that nothing would then need to be greatly updated. However, it does need to reflect the correct waivers and associated activities. So allow us to put something together in writing to give you, more information surrounding that. I see here, something from Lindsay, something from Rain as well. So we'll just get something out to everybody and circle back to be 100% clear. And also for part 2 of the webinar, we do a very extensive breakdown and timeline, because this has come up every training session as to like, when should we do what, when, as far as the public review process. So thank you for the question though.
Thanks, Crystal. Okay, so with that, I know that's been a lot of information that's been covered, and there's just a bit more to cover, but for now, let's take a quick break, give you guys a chance to stretch your legs, get a glass of water, kind of let some of what you've just heard sink in, and then we'll reconvene for the remainder of the webinar. Let's amend our 10-minute break just slightly, and let's say we'll take about 7 minutes, and we'll reconvene just about 6 minutes after 4 o'clock. So 4:06 is when we will reconvene and move along with our presentation. So thanks everybody, and we'll see you back in a few. Everybody, I hope that was a useful and refreshing break, and that your brain is ready to move forward through our presentation. Next, we will talk more about public engagement, and for that, I will turn it back over to Crystal.
All right, thank you. Oh, thank you, Laura. Thanks, everyone. Hope you had a great break. And special thanks to Philip for that overview on getting started. I certainly echo the encouragement for engagement with your staff, your residents, your community stakeholders. They really are the ones that help you to determine your local need, right? So the process of public engagement is more than 1 or 2 conversations, or just to simply check a box for the requirements of the operations notice. But it's really an understanding of each aspect of the MTW waivers, the associated activities, assessing the impact of the activities, and establishing a hardship policy are all part of the entire planning process. And so before you get started in your public review process and publishing what you're planning on doing, a lot of that should actually be thought about, fleshed out. You could have a draft hardship policy in place, and a draft impact analysis in place, but you can have those drafts in place, and once you get started in going through the 45-day review period, and then onto the public hearings, hear back from your community stakeholders and your residents, and may actually even change the scope and how you're going to implement your activities. So it's a huge element of what needs to happen in order to execute a successful activity. And people have a right to know, and they want to know what changes are occurring and understand the why, and have a voice for their suggestions or concerns to feel heard. And so one of the biggest issues faced with implementing changes is just poor timing and communication, right? Even right now, we're talking about like we're having to work on getting our regular PHA plan in, we're undergoing training for the supplement, getting access to the system. Everything is just simultaneously happening at the same time. So kudos to this group though, because you guys are already speaking to your residents and to your different organizations, different stakeholders, and that's awesome. A lot of times that is what heavily indicates like the issue is because there's just this common like myth of there's an issue of poor timing. And then also sometimes there's this common myth that all issues can just be resolved at once, trying to do everything at one time. And we don't have to do everything at one time. And all our plans decided prior to engaging these external parties. The myth often results in poor engagement and comes a little too late or move others to embrace change. It kind of just sways people from being receptive to listening to something because they too think that it's maybe a check in the box. So it's valuable to bring the key stakeholders into the initial conceptualization discussions about your plans, as well as involving them in implementation to ease the change process as well. So we know that getting residents to engage can be challenging. As with the supplements that we've received to date, we've seen some that have really taken the reins and done a great job. Some others where we wanted them to flesh it out a bit more and to tell us more about the engagement and what it looked like and what they did, just out of curiosity and understanding for HUD. And some may perceive the hearings as, I think, a check in the box process also. So not something that would be a good use of their time, maybe, but be thinking about what it looks like best for your agency. Who will be in charge of posting the agency's minimum 45-day public review period of its plan and encouraging participation in the plan process, followed by the public hearings. We mentioned the agency-specific waivers and the safe harbor waivers. Those require a separate public hearing on top of the MTW supplement, right? On top of what you discussed for your PHA plan. So you really have to make sure that you're reading the requirements from the MTW operations notice, and that's going to make sure that everything comes together, that your public knows what's going on, and that will also stop any delays or prevent as many delays as possible within the review process when you finally submit it into HUD. So what will your agency's public hearing be held face-to-face? A lot of agencies are taking a hybrid approach, which is certainly best fit, I think, in this day and age. So the MTW public process is just different. It really requires a comprehensive strategy with a deliberate approach to reach meaningful feedback. And when it's done right, it's a real process. So you'll need all 4 of these steps that you see here listed here on the screen. Trust, building trust, establishing trust, education, inclusivity, and preparation. And while there is no one right way to engage residents in your community, I think that the successful strategies generally include establishing trust, engage early and often. Begin engagement efforts with an honest assessment of where your agency is currently in terms of your relationships and your reputation with your community. How is what you're trying to do being honestly received, and what is the level of trust? Figure out ways to maintain it and strengthen the trust, and be clear and transparent, be inclusive, follow through on what you say you'll do when you hit a bump in the road, and you may be honest about it and share what can be done to address it. So also educate your stakeholders about MTW. The biggest facade is, what is MTW? Like they hear moving to work, they're like, oh, everybody's gonna, it's gonna be work requirements that are a part of this, and they're gonna make us go back to work. And that's not just, as you all know, it's not what moving to work is about, MTW. So agencies are required to involve your residents and your stakeholders, provide them an opportunity to review through participation with the resident advisory board or tenant association. If you don't have one established, I think there's a requirement to do so, but definitely that has to be a part of it. That's mandatory. And it helps, right, to foster more extensive involvement and to build that buy-in for your local support. And consider not just I mentioned this earlier, consider involving more than just the RAB, the resident advisory board, the residents, but your staff, your board, your local government, partner agencies, your HUD field office. Talking to us early and often is going to also be key to making sure that you're coming up with very fruitful activities and plans. So your MTW program is not going to just materialize in a vacuum. Your agency has a history in your community. Build off of those successes. You've had learn from any pitfalls you encountered, and the relationship skills that you build over time will help you to effectively engage your community. And now doing so as an MTW agency is just really opening up a lot of doors. So another thing is like with this is to come prepared. So carefully consider how to structure your meetings to cover the key topics in ways that really clearly convey and also encourage a range of people to contribute ideas. So a lot of times I see on the list of attendees, it's a lot of staff, which is wonderful. But how do we expand past that to make sure that we have as many participants as possible so we can figure out how to provide, like, here are the meeting goals and context, share information, answer questions, and get feedback from all different types of parties of individuals that will be ultimately affected. And of course, be inclusive to engage your community effectively. I think that, you find ways to give diverse groups a voice, be proactive about welcoming all voices into the conversation. That will, help in doing so, like by removing physical barriers, remove any cultural or language barriers where possible, and remove barriers for households and different logistical needs such as work hours, childcare, and transportation challenges. All of these things are things that we need, have to think about. So the online training manual, and we keep dropping that gem, but the online training manual has some very helpful information about engaging with your staff, your residents, your communities. And again, mentioned part 2 of the supplement training. We plan on talking more about some of the best practices to engage your public. But until then, a key thing to remember that will save you time in the review and approval process is to ensure that MTW waivers selected by your agency will implement, that your agency will implement should be spelled out for the public. And please be sure to include that documentation that support the implementation and the requirements of the activity. Maybe not just copy and paste what it says in the MTW operations, but really flesh out how you all will implement the program. As you said before, like you've included these things in your ACOP and your admin plan and the initial, so that's good. And that it should include the full description of the waiver, okay? Citing those regulations and the statutes that are being waived as a part of the request. And even, like I said, the impact analysis and hardship policy. If those documents haven't been finalized, that makes sense. But HUD is going to be specifically asking and looking for what the feedback received was from the public comments, and looking to see if there were any notable revisions or updates based off of the feedback from the public hearings. So again, please reference the MTW operations notice for those requirements for the public comment and review period. Remember the importance to involve your board, your community, your residents, and please keep in mind that, you have to include the narrative describing your analysis of the recommendations and any decisions made on these recommendations from the public process. That is one of the requirements for your upload and when you're submitting in your MTW supplement. That's specifically what we'll be looking for to see how you took that feedback and, what recommendations were taken and what changes were made as a result of them, if any. Okay, so the MTW operations notice, it's bare minimum, but we want to make sure that you're talking, you're engaging, and you get the buy-in. It's critical to success. Next slide. Oh, questions.
All right, thank you, Crystal. Are there any questions about what you just heard about the public engagement process? Give you a moment to think about those, and as a reminder, you can either enter those in the chat, or if you would like, you can come off mute and ask your question verbally.
So this is Mitzi. My question is, if your first submission, I would like to know if there is more expected from the moving to work supplement other than our proposed waivers included in the plan, how we plan to, our plans basically, because it's the beginning, and then once HUD approved, then the activities will begin, right?
Right, for all intents and purposes, once you receive a HUD approval letter, and the letter will outline what the agency has been approved to do, whether that's the MTW waivers, a safe harbor waiver, agency-specific waiver, then at that point, once you receive approval, then you're allowed to begin implementation. I would say, the only caveat would be if there were cohort-specific waivers in addition to that, where you would want to work more closely with the evaluators to figure out if everyone needed to begin at the same time with certain specific activities.
Okay.
Yep, and that's a great point, Crystal, for the asset building specific activities. Remember, you can develop the activities and include them in your supplement. The evaluator is just asking for you to wait for enrollment of the participants until they can collect baseline information and do that as a group.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
And with that, let's send it back to Crystal for one final segment of our presentation before we wrap up.
Perfect. Okay, all right. Charting the course. All right, so kind of familiarizing yourself with MTW operations notice, the asset building cohort selection notice, engaging with your staff, your residents, your community stakeholders, and now bringing you to what we've learned to chart the course ahead, okay? So as we stated, it's really a thought process you're going to want to go through here as you prepare to complete your supplement. One good thing I saw that was put in the chat, well, and I think it was Rain, he said that, they took the MTW supplement PDF version, created maybe a Word document and had everything in writings, right? So putting that visual in front of you, I have the PDF right by me as well, but it's just a great place to get started. It's just figuring out what you want to do at your MTW agency, and it's by identifying what your desired outcome is, right? So before you get to that place, like put it in writing, start to brainstorm. What are the effects and impact that you want to see at your agency? And then what you want to determine, which of the statutory objectives would your agency want to concentrate on? Is it housing choice, cost efficiency, or self-sufficiency, right? All right, or a blend as this with many activities. So by starting at the end goal and working your way back, it will help you to begin to identify the activity or activities needed to successfully achieve those desired outcomes. And in doing so, you may also find that you'll need waivers to accomplish your agency's desired results, right? So you want to keep your new best friend, the MTW operations notice, you want to keep it handy to determine within Appendix 1, which of the MTW waivers and the associated activities you want to implement. If there's any special waivers, agency specific or safe harbor waivers that you will need, and whether or not, your proposed activity has the waiver authority that you're really looking for to meet that end goal. So once you determine what waivers are needed, you want to plug all of that information into the supplement via the online form, or like I said, alternatively, if you're in the planning stages and you're not ready to officially submit into HUD, you can also take a look at the PDF version of the form to house all of your great ideas. And this will also be key in communicating with your public. I think it's a great resource to do so in that format. So this supplement, it's really just a repository for all of your great ideas. And some additional tips to keep in mind as you chart for it are sometimes a single activity may require several waivers, okay? And sometimes it won't need a waiver at all. So think carefully about what it is your agency is seeking to achieve and tailor your requests and your waiver requests accordingly. And don't let the MTW waivers listed in the MTW operations notice limit your thinking. Reading through them and picking the ones that sound good, or picking waivers other agencies have implemented already, may not always be the right choices for you. But you need to use the flexibilities of MTW to meet your local needs. not make your agency's program fit into, another program, another agency, but what works best for you. And look at those pre-vetted waivers. I say that about the other agencies, but a lot of those pre-vetted MTW waivers and appendix ones we took because we knew that, they were incorporated and vetted in a way where we say they're not pre-approved because it requires a letter for actual approval from HUD, but they are pre-vetted because we've looked at what other agencies have successfully implemented before, okay? And also, MTW waivers are the quickest, they're the easiest to use, but you can also use the safe harbor waivers and the agency-specific waivers if it is what meets your vision, okay? Start with some of the easy activities, the low-hanging fruit. Build some credibility, some trust, practice managing your changes. So a lot that's coming your way, and learn how the process works. So plan to build in more complex activities over time. It's a marathon, it's not a sprint. And remember the word to the wise we have shared from other cohorts, you do not have to choose all of the waivers that you want to implement all at one time, okay? You can choose just a selected few waivers that it's realistic for your agency to implement in the first year and include those in your MTW supplement, okay? And you can always add additional waivers in the coming years, even mid-year through an amendment, okay? You can add them in the future. So remember, it doesn't have to be perfect. Feel free to think big or creative and be strategic in taking your time. So I would imagine that the new, MTW expansion agencies will typically start with selecting easy activities and then begin the more complex activities once you establish more trust. But there are a ton of helpful resources available to you towards the end of the slide. So please also take the time to review the information. Take your time in establishing your goals and to clearly be able to identify what impact your agency's activities have. There's always an impact. I heard Allison say earlier as a best practice, it could be that it's not an impact analysis that is required, but there's always an impact. So even when it's not required within safe harbor parameters, you can still, still implement that, still conduct that. So your agency, select all the activity, don't have to select all activities once, focus on more activities that you can implement in coming fiscal years. And, we're excited about what you guys are going to submit and what's going forward. And I see some other questions are in the chat, so I look forward to also talking to you about these. I'm going to go to the next slide. Oh, yeah.
Well, we have, I see a few more questions in the chat and a few comments. We have just a couple of minutes left, so know that if we do not get to all of your questions, we are capturing them. We will take a look at them and we'll make sure that they are answered and acknowledged. I wonder if, Crystal, we could very briefly address Erin's question, which is wondering if you can review the public process timeline for an MTW agency and answer whether there is a requirement for more than one public hearing. So if you could maybe speak on that very briefly, and then we'll of course capture that and provide more detail if needed.
Sure. Okay. And I wanted to say, like, the reminder that the title is "and the public process," because this part 2, we're going to dive a lot deeper into the timelines. Okay. And I see Missy, you had your hand raised as well. But as far as the public hearings, there has to be the 45-day where your supplement, all of your plans are out for review for 45 days. And after the 45 days, there is a required public hearing. And I also wanted to mention, because this is often missed a lot in the submissions, should you have an agency-specific waiver or a safe harbor waiver, then it's required that you have a separate public hearing for the special waiver. Now, they can be done at the same exact date, same exact time, but it does have to be specified as a separate recorded public hearing. So I hope that answer, I was trying to kind of go fast, but no worries. We're going to go over any questions that were missed, and also we will dive more into it in part 2.
Well, thank you, Crystal. And again, just to echo what Crystal said, much more to come in part 2, so we will certainly capture all of the questions that have come in through the chat and make sure that those are thoroughly answered leading up to the next webinar or at the next webinar. So I think let's go ahead and move on to our final couple of slides where we can draw your attention to a variety of resources. All of the ones you see on the screen, click those links, make sure that you are familiar with them and know how to navigate to those resources so that you can get the information you need. One thing that I'd like to draw your attention to is something that Crystal mentioned earlier on in this presentation, which is the MTW supplement web-based form PHA demo. So we mentioned that it's available on the MTW supplement webpage, and when you're ready to be entering your information into the web-based form, be sure to take a look at that demo so that you can know exactly how to do that. And then moving on to our final slide, just a reminder about the upcoming webinars in this series. As we mentioned, the next webinar will be a follow-on to this one. It is the MTW supplement and tips for success, where we will go into more detail all about the MTW supplement and more specifically on the online form. That will be on March 15th. And then the HUD 50058 MTW expansion form changes on April 5th. And an office hours session for any questions that have come up since this series of webinars on April 26th. So be sure to keep your eyes out for those, and we hope to see you then. And finally, remember that you always have access to the MTW Asset Building email account.